Twilight felt as though she should be drowning. The chemicals congealed around her body, crowding in every crevice and hammering at every pore. She swore that she could feel the weight of every individual drop pressing down on her from above and around. The chamber she was in was airtight, with only a semblance of oxygen, being the canned stuff that was pumped through the pipes and into the cumbersome mask that was locked onto her face. There was a few faint prickling sensations from the cables and wires stuck into her at various points, but most of them just ended up being background noise as her body concentrated on the fact that it thought it was being slowly crushed to death. Maybe this is why Celestia allowed equestrian culture to go mostly unchanged for 1,000 years. Change isn't scary, just really uncomfortable and hard to wash out of your coat. The buzzer that indicated a completed process went off, setting Twilight's teeth on edge as the vibrations began to reverberate through the liquid. As the various cloning fluids drained through the grates on the floor, Twilight cursed at the idea of building a warning buzzer in a chamber filled with one of the strongest conductors of vibrations in the universe. Surely, the liquid straining away from around the body would be enough of an alert that the process was over. She noted to herself to remove the buzzers before the next experiment. The wires fell away with a few sharp tugs, and the mask hung even heavier on her muzzle. She went to unscrew it with her magic, but suddenly, her horn was barely even able to make a spark. Twilight had started to panic. Her magic could not have failed her now, could it? There was nothing magic retardant in the cloning fluids. Hell, she specifically made it hyperconductive to magical energy, just in case the magnetization did not take in the initial sequencing. And even if the process rendered those fluids inert after the process was finished, that should not have affected her. Unless... Oh, that is not good. Twilight was in full-on panic mode now. She hurried to get the mask off of her by banging it against the wall of the chamber. But it took an embarrassingly long 3 seconds for her to remind herself that she could just use her hooves to unscrew the mask. Once it was done, the mask clattered to the floor, and she did her best to rip the chamber door open. It slid open with a faint hiss, oblivious to the gravity of the situation. Twilight stumbled out into the bright lights at the Borealis Institute's cloning laboratory. Well, technically it was a bioengineering wing of the Institute's parent company, Life Incorporated. But at that point, she was just arguing semantics with herself in a moment of crisis. The point was that the room she was in right now was outfitted and designated specifically for the Borealis cloning project, with 5 cloning chambers, enormous tanks of the various required fluids, and a little stand with a clipboard in front of each chamber. The clipboard bears a short essay of Twilight's, entitled, "So you just discovered you're a clone with no past and a theoretically infinite future." She put it in front of every chamber, because she never really knew which chamber would be used to house the template. The Institute was only making 1 clone today, and the process was still very finicky. The last time they got the balance wrong, they ended up with a sheep that believed in an end indentured servitude. One unstable alicorn was a cakewalk compared to that. The clone was still floating in its chamber. Twilight checked the timer, with 3 minutes until the chamber drained. That was good, because it gave Twilight time to stop panicking. At least, she hoped. The chemicals floating in the chamber practically sparkled with magic, looking more like a gas than a fluid. The clone was basking in so much energy, Twilight wouldn't be surprised if parts of its skin were cracking under the pressure. Meanwhile, her horn only now sparked with the most rudimentary of lighting spells. She felt like she was running at 2% power, and the other 98% was floating in the chamber. That was a problem. Now, the most logical explanation for the problem was that the clone had unconsciously absorbed her magic. All of it. Nearly down to the bone, while functionally comatose with only half a brain at best, through a system that was primarily designed to briefly archive and transfer DNA sequences on a one-way stream. Well, if there was any pony who could pull that off, it was definitely Twilight. But even so, it seemed an unlikely reality, as was the case with most logical assumptions. The next most obvious option was that there was some kind of power surge that fried Twilight's horn temporarily and overwhelmed the clone. That would explain the extended gestation period and almost everything else. Except for one small issue. The Borealis Institute had its own dedicated power grid to protect against exactly this sort of thing happening, so that option was out. The third solution was that the timer was blinking between 2 minutes 58 seconds and 2 minutes and 57 seconds for the past 30 seconds, and those fluids were looking more and more like an illusion spell. The third solution was that the clone had been awake for a long time, and only now had Twilight just woken up. As though sensing her realization, the clone dissipated from her illusion. It stared through the clear glass at Twilight, and it was almost like looking into a mirror. The process had captured her perfectly, from the detail on her feathers to that unconscious little grin that she seemed to default these days. It was kind of creepy, and she wasn't sure if she'd ever be able to get used to it. The door slid open, and the clone stepped out into its new world. Its first steps were remarkably stable for a newborn. Then again, the current theory suggested that she had a few hours to practice, so Twilight guessed that that made sense. From there, Twilight could feel the clone brimming over with magic. If it weren't for the disturbing hollowness of her own body, she'd probably be impressed at how accurately the process could copy her magic into another body without making it explode. The clone coughed, and it returned its attention to Twilight. In her head, she was already running through the conversation she gave to every clone. The clone would be confused, dazed, and possibly ashamed of its own mistake. Judging from the look of childish innocence in its eyes, she probably didn't steal the magic maliciously. This might even have been just an undocumented reaction between clones that Twilight had not been prepared for. Whatever the case, she was ready for whatever question the clone may have for her.
Excellent work, Subject 6.
Of course, Twilight said she was never ready for everything. The half-assembled speech died in Twilight's throat, and all of her prepared answers gave way to a single question.
I'm sorry, what?
She could feel the tickle of magic on her ears, as though the clone was checking that Twilight could still hear. To be fair, it was not a misplaced concern.
I said excellent work. And it really is excellent. You've given us a lot of fantastic data to work with. Thanks to your actions today, psychologists in the future will be better prepared to deal with the consequences of temporary loss of magic in unicorns.
At that, the clone smiled and released Twilight's ear. Twilight suddenly noticed a clipboard floating in the clone's magic, accompanied closely by a quill. Where did the clone even get those? Okay, there was two possibilities here. One was that the clone's memories had gotten screwed up, and she thinks that she's the original. 2, she knows that she's the clone, but was trying to convince Twilight that she was the clone, so she could steal Twilight's life. Either way, Twilight knew what experiment she was conducting today, and it wasn't what she was talking about.
Temporary loss of magic isn't a thing.
Twilight expected the clone to crack under pressure. She expected it to act confused, to try and prove her wrong. She did not expect her to smile like she just answered the Fermi paradox.
Well, of course it isn't. Not yet anyway, but it could be. None of us really know what the future holds after all. And considering how resource efficient the cloning process is, we may as well test for every possible outcome.
That almost sounded exactly like Twilight's thought process in such a situation. In fact, it was actually a brilliant idea. It would also perfectly explain why Twilight's magic was missing, if it weren't for the fact that the clone had erased Twilight's memory of what she was doing today.
That's a pretty big leap in logic, seeing as you're the first stable clone this project has produced.
Twilight had dealt with a lot of villains over the years. More than a few made an effort to pretend that they were not the villain, and they all tended to react differently when they were exposed. Some of them went into extreme denial. Some were shocked and horrified at being found out. Some would even curse at her or run for the hills. But no pony had ever just hung their head and sighed when Twilight discovered their evil plot.
And the scans looked so promising. You're not Twilight Sparkle, Subject 6. I am.
Twilight just barely stopped herself from laughing. She could not honestly think that that act would work on her, right?
Look, I know what's going on here. You can't fool me.
The clone sighs a third time. This one was especially forceful.
At least you're only missing the last few weeks. The first 3 clones didn't even know what the Borealis Institute was.
The clone put down her clipboard and went to walk past Twilight. In an attempt to stop it, Twilight tried to extend a wing, but her wings did not respond to the command. Did this clone seriously steal her Pegasus magic as well?
It must be a compression issue. Maybe, if we keep the next one under for longer, and leave the transfer until they've finished growing, the brain will get a complete mesh.
This was getting ridiculous. This clone must have realized that it's lost by now. She couldn't honestly think that she can just keep talking and Twilight will just forget to rein her in.
The jig is up, Twilight. Stop trying to talk your way out of this. Just give yourself up. You're the clone, and you hit me with a sleep spell, so you could siphon off my magic.
It felt so wrong to use that name, but it was probably the only one that the clone would respond to. Twilight rounded up on the clone, and was just about to read it its rights, when she suddenly began to float up into the air. The clone turned to face Twilight, and its eyes and horn began to glow.
No, you're the clone, and you were born without magic. Your entire skeletal structure is shot through with microscopic filaments of Horivian unichain. The best you'll ever manage is a level 2 illumination spell, and even that would probably make your heart explode.
The clone's hair had started to blow in a wind that was not even there.
You are a clone with paranoid delusions, bred and born for the sole purpose of seeing if unicorns robbed of magic default to paranoid delusions.
Twilight could not believe what she was saying. No, she would not believe what this clone was saying. She remembered what it felt like to have magic. She knew what the Horivian restraints felt like, and there wasn't even the slightest twinge of that alien sensation in any part of her body. This clone had to be lying to her. It had to be. But she could not stop it. The best she could do was not go gentle.
That's just what you want me to think.
Twilight spat in defiance, but it came to a slow halt before the clone approached her and was no more than 2 inches from her nose. The clone's hair had stopped floating, and its eyes had stopped glowing. The spell that surrounded her began to blink out, and Twilight fell to the ground. The clone's horn began to spark and shimmer with a familiar spell, and the world had started to turn purple.
Goodbye, Subject 6.
A smug grin of satisfaction was the only thing that Twilight saw before everything went to black.